Hello, Parsboro Community Radio listeners. Welcome to Exploring the Neighborhood with your hosts, Thor and Debbie, here on CICR 99.1 on your FM dial. We'd like to thank Kanza as the sponsor for our show.
For those of you who are not aware, Kanza is Cumberland County's only careers Nova Scotia centre and a vital participant in this area's road to prosperity. This year, Kanza is celebrating 15 years of serving the area and providing valuable employment and educational opportunities. Our goal for Exploring the Neighborhood is to take you on a series of half-hour adventures that include road trips, candid interviews, and commentaries.
We'll focus on the area's homegrown businesses, unique landmarks, and emerging talent. We're hoping to shine a well-deserved light on the local endeavors that promote eco-friendliness and self-sufficiency. On today's episode, we're taking another trip into the past to visit Nova Scotia a full century ago.
The First World War was in full swing, but that was far away, across the ocean, over there in Europe.
Let's listen as Dr. Walter Borden tells the moving story of the 2nd Construction Battalion.
Recorded live on February 27th at the Community Center in Spring Hill during African Heritage Month.
Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Dr. Walter Borden.
Well, thank you very much for having me here tonight. This is a joy for me. This is the first opportunity that I've ever had to speak on the 2nd Construction Battalion. It's a great joy for me to do it. These were people who lived. They were once young. They were young men. They had dreams. They had plans. And then life happened, as life does. They look out at us, frozen in time now, and that's often the way. And I want to bring them alive. As a matter of fact, those 4 men there are relatives. But I'm going to start out in the usual way that we do in these things. I'll give you a little background. The 2nd Construction Battalion, Canadian Expeditionary Force, CEF, that's what I'll say from now on, was raised in Nova Scotia and was the only predominantly black battalion in Canadian military history, and also the only Canadian battalion composed of black soldiers to serve in World War I. It was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel D.H. Sutherland. All of the unit's 19 officers were white, with the exception of Captain William A. White, the unit's chaplain. Well, picture it, Nova Scotia, 1914. Everybody in Canada, in the Western world, in the world, woke up one morning and heard that we were at war. Most people then, even more so than today, because they didn't have television and things like that, they weren't very up on geopolitical anything. Word got around, there was a war. What did that mean? Well, they knew that Britain was involved in that war. They didn't know really why, and no one really took much stock in that. The fact was, Britain was at war. If Britain was at war, we were at war, because we were part of the Commonwealth. They wouldn't understand that somewhere far off across the world, a man who was known as the Archduke Ferdinand of Austro-Hungarian Empire had been shot. And because he was shot, that started a world war. All they knew was that everyone was now called to arms. And there was a huge flurry, recruits called up, that type of thing. And the black men of this province and across the country, they got the spirit too. They had the patriotic spirit. They were ready to go too. They were not welcome. Now, you have to think about that. The times, we're talking about 1914. When the war first broke out, enlistments reached a peak of 30,000 a month. That's a lot. They just kept coming. But the thing was that nobody knew what kind of war that was going to be over there. And they were dying, being killed by the thousands. And what had happened by 1916, recruitment was down to 6,000 a month. They needed people. What are they going to do? Well, they then turned their attention to these men who had been trying to get in for these 2 years. And still, in spite of the fact that they needed them that badly, there were still many who were firmly against it. Nevertheless, in Great Britain, the War Ministry said, go ahead, form the battalion. All right. Initially, it was supposed to be just Nova Scotian blacks. Unfortunately, after a month's recruiting, they only had 180 men. By the time 1970 came around, in March of 1917, they had managed to get 150 men from the United States, and the rest from Canada. And so with a contingent of 600, they had the 2nd Construction Battalion and sailed off to Europe. When they got there, they were still not treated well. So by the time that May came around, now this is from March to May, the battalion was demoted to a company. And the company was merged with the Canadian Forestry Corps. And as such, the men were supposed to, contrary to what they thought they were going to be doing, fighting, no, they were there to cut the timber, build bridges, build roads, build picket fences, dig trenches. They were also required to detonate landmines and to bring out the wounded. Now think about that for a minute. Just building the bridges and the roads is one thing. But detonating landmines, this is to pave the way for the forces coming behind them. Well, of course, the enemy is not sitting idle. And the enemy is going to do everything it can to prevent these bridges from being built, these roads from being constructed. They're certainly going to try to protect their landmines. These men from the 2nd Battalion, they were given axes, saws, shovels, no guns. And yet they did their job. They did their job. Near the end of the war, in the beginning of 1918, again, nature takes over. There had been so many killed, so many wounded, that on the battlefield, a lot of the things that you once thought go away. There are bonds built that people outside don't understand. And so, some of the men did end up with arms and fighting and distinguished themselves. Once again, we learn things, we meaning all of us, in various ways, various sundry ways, simple ways. But it seemed to me also to be uniquely special that relationship happened not from somebody from some other part of the world. It was Nova Scotian and Nova Scotian. And so it's something that is uniquely, in a lot of ways, a uniquely Nova Scotian thing. We show people across the country a lot of things. We really do. We set the bar. And there's a good little phrase there, because everybody I've talked about tonight set the bar, and they set the bar very high, but they didn't know they were setting a bar, which is a wonderful thing. You don't have to go out to some great stage in the world. Sometimes you could be great right here at home. They learned in making those sacrifices and then taught to us so that we had shoulders very, very broad to stand on. And that is the greatest honor that I can give to the men of the 2nd Construction Battalion. And I can give them no greater honor than that. Thank you.
Thank you to all those that made the event a success.
Miss Leah Killen, the Murray family, the talent, the crew, Kanza, and the multitude of guests that showed up for the commemorative celebration.
Next, we're going to continue our interview with Mr. Ray Coulson, curator of the Nova Scotia Highlanders Regimental Museum.
From the brochure, I'll highlight the summary. The museum originated quietly from a few pictures and artifacts in the warrant officers' and sergeants' mess at the armory as part of its decor.
As the collection of pictures and plaques began to grow, the idea of expanding into a museum was raised.
Official accreditation was finally granted, confirming it to be a military museum on April 26, 1989, by the Canadian Forces Museum Committee in Ottawa.
Open to the public year-round, the museum houses a vast collection of military artifacts and unique displays that tell the story of the Nova Scotia Highlanders and their contribution to our history.
The Nova Scotia Highlander Regimental Museum. And it's at 36 Acadia Street in Amherst, Nova Scotia, for those of you who want to find it. And just to give a quick plug, the phone number here is 902-661-6797. I'd like to mention that Ray and his partner Bill Green travel throughout the Maritimes and provide our schools with a hands-on approach to history,
bringing unique historical artifacts directly to the students, providing them with genuine local heroes and the true tales of their exploits.
My favorite aspect is that their stories don't always have to be about faraway lands and the destruction that war brings. The stories are sometimes very personal.
My sister, for example, Naval Heating up here in Amherst, they used to bring the bombers in there to refit and send them out again. So she got in with one of the chaps that was flying these things. Of course, this bomber fixed up and it was sent back over to England. Later on, she got a telegram from him saying that the bomber he's in was crashed, and he got burnt up so badly that he wasn't coming back to Canada. And he just stayed right in the hospital. But that's the type of things that were happening on the home front. And there's a lot of sadness and a lot of, and the kids, I remember when I was 9 or 10, looking at the old creek out here, and scared to death that there was a submarine coming up the creek. And now I look at it, it's about 6 feet wide, maybe. The kids actually worried. They worried, and especially at home, because we were sitting down by bars there, and these bombers were coming in on a regular basis in Namalheaton, and they were backfiring and everything else. By the time they get sent to Namalheaton, they were in bad shape. They had to refit them and this type of thing. I did a lecture at high school in West Highlands, and I was saying, nowadays the crossing guards at every intersection and let the kids cross. And I can remember when I used to come up Hickman Hill, and I stopped at the old track where the bombers came down. I would stop there and wave at the pilot. The wings would go over my head, and the propeller would go, down to the Namalheaton. And nobody ever had a crosswalk there.
It wasn't as protected as it is now.
Yeah, we used to look at those guys as heroes in those days. And and they were something else. But the museum is something I started just out of a sheer love for these guys that were in the Memory Club. I just had a feeling if I didn't start it, then down the road nobody ever remembered them at all.
And tell us what kind of things are in this museum.
Somebody come to me one time and said, "What do you have in here that's one of a kind?" I said, "Well, if you're a North Novie, it's probably all one of a kind." One of the big things we have that's one of a kind is the Nova Scotia flag on the wall in the museum. This Nova Scotia flag was given to by Premier Nova Scotia in the park down here in Amherst. They took it overseas and flew it all the time overseas with the battalion. And they came home and they gave it back to the Premier Nova Scotia today, 1947, and he took it down to the archives in Halifax. And one of the corporals in North Novies, Earl Crouchy, and I went down and got it from the archives and restored it and put it back in the museum. That's another thing. When I go to schools, I ask the kids, what was the very first flag raised in Germany at the end of the war in October of '44? Everybody says, well, American, Russian, whatever. I said, no, it was the Nova Scotia flag. The North Novies went right up the west coast of Europe, crossed over into Germany, and when they crossed the Rhine, they come up to this house. No damage to the house at all. They thought, well, that's very curious because everything else around there was pretty well blown apart. So they went into the house. Lo and behold, they find out it was Hermann Goering's house, a high-ranking Nazi officer. The North Novies, when they set up the observation post there, Mr. Grant and the RSM set up that flag on the lawn. And that was the very first flag raised on German soil. And it was a Nova Scotia flag. It was very important, really. The other thing we get over there is this building's named the Colonel James Leighton Ralston Building, after Colonel James Leighton Ralston of the First World War. We got a saddle from the First World War over there, in which he was wounded twice. We got letters that he wrote to the nurses who treated him, thanking them for treating him. And Colonel James Leighton Ralston was from the area here, and he was Minister of Defense twice, Minister of Finance, and he only gave up the Minister of Defense when conscription came in, and Prime Minister wouldn't go along with it, so he quit because he needed troops overseas in the First World War. He has quite a record from a local guy from here. There's an original piano made here during the war years of Amherst Piano. It was one that we used to use up in the mess. Everybody would gather around and sing old war songs. We were in the militia back in the 70s and 60s. And
one of my last episodes was on the old piano factory, which is now a recording studio and a musical parts manufacturer.
Oh, down here. Yeah. Were the parts for that piano made somewhere else and sent here and assembled, or did they actually make the whole piano from scratch?
They made the whole piano here.
Ray's most fascinating story, and in a way, the most frightening, is during the Second World War. How close the German military actually was to the Maritimes, Quebec, and the whole eastern seaboard.
Personal stories here in the museum is that Major Whiteman, Ralph Whiteman, was stationed down in the valley, Annapolis Valley. He got married down there. Later, he was posted to Newfoundland. His wife, after a few weeks, was going over to Newfoundland to meet up with him again. And she took the Caribou ferry from Cape Breton to Newfoundland. Halfway across, a submarine sunk the ferry, and everybody on the ferry was lost. And what we have, you refer to a map, and what this map tells you, how many ships were lost off the coast of Nova Scotia and up the St. Lawrence River. The submarines could go right up the St. Lawrence River, right into Quebec, sink some ships in the dock, turn around, come back out again with impunity. A friend of mine, Cape Breton, used to show me one year we were over there, that up along the coast of Labrador, there's caves washed out from the ocean. And that's where the submarines used to resupply. They restocked those caves. And if they ran out of groceries, they used to take a two-man submarine, go down along the coast of Cape Breton until they found a store out in the country somewhere. And they had French uniforms on, and they could speak French. They'd go in, reorder all the supplies, go back up and restock their, and that's what they worked out of, really. And so that was pretty close to, to the Maritimes, really.
There's much more to that story, but we'll let Mr. Bill Green explain that one on another episode. Speaking of Bill Green, I had the opportunity to sit down and chat with him last week. A man of many stories, important tales of heroism that we don't want to rush through. We'll be spreading the stories out over the year, bringing home the past. Speaking of days gone by, Bill gave us a hands-on demonstration of texting, the old school way.
I'm not a radio operator. I only know 4 letters. The first 2 are SOS. And as we explained, when the Titanic hit the iceberg in 1912, the radio operator was sending out SOS, which sounds like this. And so he would send out SOS, followed by the last known position of the Titanic and its last known course and speed. Of course, it was not going very fast after it struck the iceberg. So he would have been sending out SOS. I know that eventually, I think it was the Carpathian, picked up the signal and was able to come and rescue some of the survivors from the sinking of the Titanic in 1912. The next letter that I know is the letter V. Sir Winston Churchill rallied the British people with a simple hand signal, which was the letter V. V was for victory in Britain. When the war is over, when we have won the war. There was never any doubt in the minds of the people in Britain that Britain was going to prevail. And thanks to Canada and the other Commonwealth countries, and later the United States, Britain was able to prevail. The letter V is also the Roman numeral 5, and a fellow by the name of Ludwig von Beethoven had composed a symphony, and it was Beethoven's 5th Symphony. In Morse code, sounds like this. The Allies were sending coded messages into the French resistance the day before D-Day to let the resistance fighters know that the invasion was imminent. The message was conveyed in code. The Germans were listening for it. They didn't understand what it meant, but the French resistance fighters did. The only other letter that I know, the letter Q in Morse code, and the letter Q is 2 dashes, a dot, and a dash, and it sounds like this. Da 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 da, da 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 da. And that usually wakes them up after a few minutes of rest and sleep while they're trying to stay awake for our presentation.
Now, Bill, you got to imagine an entire classroom texting each other with that.
Yeah. Well, I hope they do, but I'm not sure they will.
How do you correct it when you make a mistake?
Good question. I wasn't there. I don't know.
As well as teaming up with Ray to keep the Nova Scotia Highlanders Regimental Museum alive, Bill runs another organization that preserves the individual stories of a century's worth of military veterans who fought to preserve our nation.
There's another organization that you're involved with as well. What is that?
Our registered charity is called Remembering Canada's Heroes. There were many, many heroes, both in Canada and abroad, all through the 20th century, and we try and isolate a few of them and bring them to the attention of the students in class.
These people are local heroes that are known elsewhere in the world.
Absolutely.
But we don't know about them ourselves.
That's right.
And we're not taught that in school, and that's pretty sad.
It is sad.
It's important that these heroes are remembered in our area, and I think what you are doing through your organizations are going to help keep that memory alive and hopefully teach our young children about the heroes of the past.
I agree. There are a million stories because we had 1 million men and women in service during the war. We can't tell all of those stories, but we can isolate those that we know about. There are many more heroes in the remaining 55 years of the 20th century who also need to be recognized. And in this century, of course, we have heroes from Afghanistan who need to be recognized for what they tried to achieve in that country.
We'll do our part because you and I have been talking about perhaps capturing some of those memories on video for future generations.
Okay, time has run out. If you'd like to contact us, our email is scotiaheritageproductions@gmail.com.
When it comes to local business, arts, crafts, and entertainment, we'll try our best to provide a global perspective on our community and remind listeners that where one regularly chooses to spend their money is often much more powerful than the occasional vote at the ballot box.
So, help out your talented neighbors and enjoy the unique diversity of what Cumberland, Westmoreland has to offer. And ultimately, you'll be helping yourself. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening.
So, tune in next week for another episode of Exploring the Neighborhood with your hosts, Thor and Debbie, here on CICR 99.1 on your FM dial.